The dirt road that wound its way to Marcus Taylor's ranch stretched across 3 miles of unpaved land. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his peace, his sanctuary, his home. Each morning, when the sun cracked over the horizon, Marcus liked to sip his coffee on the porch and watch the amber light sweep across the rolling pasture. He had built this place with his own 2 hands after leaving the Navy, craving freedom and silence. But one thing had started to disturb that silence: his mailbox. It began small, almost laughable. The first time, Marcus found his mailbox dented, the wooden post splintered at the base, tire tracks pressed deep into the dirt. He shook his head, replaced the post, and told himself it must have been a careless driver turning too wide. But it happened again, and again. Soon, it became clear this wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. Each time Marcus repaired it, the so-called HOA cops came back. They weren't real officers, of course. They were self-appointed enforcers from the local homeowners association, a group of neighbors who had long decided they didn't like Marcus living there. To them, he was an outsider, a black rancher who didn't fit into their picture of their tight-knit, rule-heavy community. The truth, however, was that Marcus's land wasn't even under their HOA jurisdiction, but that didn't stop them. They called themselves compliance officers, and drove around in their SUVs, harassing him at every opportunity. The mailbox was just their favorite game. They'd run it over, sometimes late at night, sometimes in broad daylight, laughing as they sped off. Marcus would come out in the morning, shake his head at the fresh set of tracks, and go to work building it back up. But the pattern wore thin. One evening, as Marcus knelt in the fading light, hammering nails into yet another replacement post, he stopped mid-swing. Sweat ran down his forehead, and his calloused hands tightened on the hammer. A quiet fire stirred in him. He'd faced worse than this in his life: combat zones where every sound could mean death, missions that demanded absolute precision and strength. Compared to those trials, this was child's play. But there was one thing Marcus had learned both in the service and in life: you don't let bullies set the rules. He leaned back on his heels, staring at the broken wood scattered at his feet. Enough, he muttered to himself. The next morning, he drove into town, not to the hardware store this time, but to a steel supply yard. The man behind the counter raised an eyebrow when Marcus placed his order. It wasn't the usual rancher's request for fencing wire or sheet metal. No, Marcus wanted reinforced steel tubing, heavy concrete mix, and a thick sheet of armor-grade plate. "You building a bunker or something?" the clerk asked with a laugh. Marcus just gave a small smile. "Something like that." Back at the ranch, Marcus set to work. He measured carefully, dug deeper into the ground than any post hole he'd dug before, and poured concrete thick enough to anchor a small fortress. The steel tube went in next, welded at the base, braced with crossbars. At the top, he mounted the armored plate, polished and painted black. From the road, it looked just like a normal, sturdy mailbox, neat, square, and unassuming. But beneath the surface, it was immovable, unbreakable. It took him 3 days, working between chores and tending to his cattle, to finish the project. When he finally stood back and admired the new mailbox, it looked ordinary, almost boring. And that was exactly the point. The HOA cops wouldn't suspect a thing. That night, he sat on his porch again, the cicadas buzzing in the thick summer air. A part of him almost hoped they'd come. Sure enough, they did. Near midnight, Marcus heard the distant hum of an engine growing louder. His eyes narrowed as headlights crested the hill. A white SUV slowed near his drive, the tires crunching on gravel. Marcus didn't move, he just leaned back in his chair, the brim of his hat tilted low. The SUV idled for a moment, then, like clockwork, the driver jerked the wheel toward the mailbox. The tires spun, gravel sprayed, and the vehicle surged forward with a loud crunch. But instead of the satisfying splinter of wood, there was a deafening metallic clang. The SUV jolted violently to a stop, the front bumper folding like paper against the hidden armor. The driver cursed loudly, fumbling to reverse. The engine roared, tires squealed, but the mailbox didn't budge, not an inch. Marcus chuckled low in his throat. From the shadows of his porch, he watched as the SUV's front end smoked, the radiator hissing. The driver finally backed away, the hood crumpled, headlights flickering. For the first time, the hunters looked like the hunted. The SUV lingered, engine sputtering, before peeling off down the road, leaving behind the sound of grinding metal and humiliation. Marcus sipped his coffee, unfazed. "Guess they didn't see that one coming," he murmured. The next morning, he walked down to the road. The mailbox stood pristine, unscathed. But the dirt bore the evidence of the night's encounter: deep skid marks, an oil stain, and shards of shattered plastic. Marcus crouched down, touched the steel post, and nodded in satisfaction. But he also knew this wasn't over. Bullies rarely quit after one hard lesson. If anything, the HOA cops would be angrier now. He could almost hear their bitter conversations. How dare he outsmart them? How dare he stand his ground? But Marcus wasn't intimidated. He'd lived through battles where the stakes were life or death. A few neighbors with inflated egos and SUVs weren't going to scare him. He went about his chores that day with a lighter step. The cows still needed feeding, the fences still needed mending, and the sun still climbed across the sky as it always did. But now, there was a small satisfaction that wasn't there before. He had turned the tables. Later that evening, a sheriff's deputy drove up his road, the dust trailing behind the cruiser. The deputy climbed out, tipping his hat. "Morning, Marcus. Got some reports about property damage down this way." "Know anything about that?" Marcus shrugged. "Mailbox is still standing, far as I can tell. Can't say the same for whoever tried to run it down." The deputy cracked a smile. He knew the stories, the complaints, the ridiculous behavior of the HOA crowd. "Well," he said, "doesn't look like you've broken any laws. Guess some folks just found out mailboxes bite back." Marcus grinned. "Guess so." As the deputy left, Marcus looked once more at his creation. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore, it was a line in the sand, a reminder that his land was his, and he wouldn't be pushed around. Whatever came next, he'd be ready. Because Marcus Taylor wasn't just any rancher. He was a man who had survived war, who had stared down enemies far more dangerous than nosy neighbors with too much free time. And if they wanted a fight, they'd find out fast that he was the wrong man to pick on. The mailbox incident quickly spread through the community like wildfire. The HOA cops, bruised ego and busted SUV in tow, couldn't keep their mouths shut. By the next day, whispers traveled across the town. Marcus Taylor's mailbox had destroyed a brand new vehicle, and not just any vehicle, a luxury SUV driven by one of the most outspoken HOA enforcers. Some people laughed quietly behind closed doors, others shook their heads in disbelief, but the HOA board wasn't amused. For them, it wasn't just about the mailbox. It was about control. Marcus had made them look foolish, and people who relied on intimidation couldn't stand losing face. So, they decided to escalate. Marcus, however, carried on like nothing had happened. That was his way. He rose at dawn, tended to his livestock, worked the land, and enjoyed the quiet. The mailbox stood at the end of the drive, solid and unyielding, a silent sentry that dared anyone to try again. Sometimes, Marcus would pause during his chores and glance toward the road, almost expecting them to return. Not with another SUV, he doubted they were that reckless, but with something else. He didn't have to wait long. 3 days after the crash, Marcus noticed unfamiliar cars creeping down his road. They didn't belong to neighbors or delivery drivers. They were shiny sedans with tinted windows, out of place on the dusty ranch route. Inside, he saw the faces of men in collared shirts, clipboards balanced on their laps. They parked at the edge of his property, just far enough to avoid trespassing, and started snapping pictures. His fences, his cattle, his mailbox, they documented everything. Marcus knew the game. These weren't police, and they weren't surveyors. They were hired by the HOA, hoping to find some technicality, some obscure violation they could twist into leverage. That evening, he called his lawyer, an old friend who had helped him close on the ranch years ago. After explaining the situation, his friend chuckled. "Marcus, they don't have a leg to stand on. Your property's outside their jurisdiction. They can huff and puff all they want, but they can't blow your house down." "Yeah," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, "but that won't stop them from trying." Sure enough, the next week, Marcus received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside were printed pages filled with legal-sounding accusations, violations of community standards, fines for obstructions to roadway visibility, and demands that he remove his mailbox immediately. The letter was signed with official-looking stamps and the HOA's logo, as if they were a government agency. Marcus read the packet slowly, then set it on the table and laughed. It was the hollow bark of someone who had seen bureaucracy at its worst. He had spent years in uniform, dealing with real regulations, life and death protocols. This paper threat, full of bluster and bad grammar, was nothing but smoke. Still, he didn't ignore it. He drafted a response, short and sharp. "To whom it may concern. Your HOA has no authority over my property. Any further harassment will be documented and forwarded to my attorney. Consider this your only warning. He sent it certified mail, just so they couldn't claim ignorance later. But if Marcus thought the letter would shut them down, he underestimated their stubbornness. The HOA cops were insulted, and insult turned to obsession. The same SUV, its front end now patched together with mismatched parts, started circling the road again. The driver would slow by Marcus's property, glaring at the mailbox as if it had personally wronged him. Other times, Marcus caught them sitting on the roadside at night, engines idling, lights off. Marcus stayed calm, but he didn't stay idle. He had learned long ago that preparation was everything. If they wanted to play games, he'd make sure the board was tilted in his favor. First, he installed cameras. Not just any cameras, military-grade, motion-triggered devices that blended into fence posts and trees. They recorded everything, from cars pulling onto his road to the shadows of coyotes slipping through the grass. Second, he reinforced the mailbox even further, adding a second steel brace beneath the soil. If someone tried explosives, he wouldn't put it past them, it wouldn't topple easily. Then he waited. It happened on a Friday night. Marcus was in the barn, closing up after feeding the cattle, when the sound of engines carried through the still air. More than one this time. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw the glow of 3 vehicles approaching. His jaw tightened. This wasn't a casual drive-by. The cars stopped at the edge of his drive. Doors slammed, and half a dozen men climbed out. Flashlights clicked on, sweeping over the pasture, the fences, and finally the mailbox. Marcus stayed where he was, his silhouette hidden in the barn's shadow. The men gathered around the mailbox, muttering. One of them kicked the steel post, then another tried tugging on the box itself. When neither budged, frustration flared. Bring the chain, someone barked. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he watched one of them pull a heavy tow chain from the back of a truck. They looped it around the mailbox, securing it tight. Another man climbed into the driver's seat, revving the engine. Their plan was simple: rip it out by brute force. But Marcus had expected this. He had poured nearly a ton of reinforced concrete around the base, anchoring it deeper than any tow truck could handle. The truck surged forward with a roar, the chain straining. Tires spun, dirt flew, and the engine howled. But the mailbox didn't move. Instead, the truck lurched, its rear wheels bouncing as the frame groaned under the pressure. With a sharp crack, the chain snapped, whipping back and shattering a taillight. The men cursed loudly, their plan falling apart. That's when Marcus stepped out of the barn, calm and deliberate. The glow of their flashlights caught his figure, broad-shouldered, steady, and utterly unafraid. "You boys lost," he called, his voice carrying easily across the night air. The men froze, caught off guard. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the ticking of their engines. One of them tried to recover. "This mailbox is a safety hazard. We're here to remove it before someone else gets hurt." Marcus walked closer, slow and steady, his boots crunching on gravel. "Funny," he said, "I don't see any badges. I don't see any uniforms. All I see are trespassers on private property." The man bristled. "We're acting on HOA authority." "Authority you don't have here," Marcus cut in. His voice was calm but firm, the same tone he'd used to defuse dangerous standoffs overseas. "Now, I suggest you get back in your trucks before I call the sheriff and hand him the footage from the last 10 minutes. He gestured toward one of the fence posts. Sure enough, a tiny red light blinked steadily, recording everything. The men exchanged nervous looks. They hadn't expected him to be watching, and they sure hadn't expected him to have evidence. "Let's go," one muttered, yanking the broken chain from the ground. One by one, they climbed back into their vehicles, engines growling as they turned around. The last truck lingered a moment, its headlights glaring at Marcus, before peeling off into the night. When the dust settled, Marcus stood alone beside the unshaken mailbox. He rested a hand on the steel post and allowed himself a small smile. They had tried everything: intimidation, legal threats, brute force, and the mailbox had outlasted them all. As he walked back toward the house, Marcus knew they wouldn't quit completely. People like that rarely did. But each time they tried and failed, they only revealed themselves for what they truly were: powerless without their games. And Marcus Taylor was done playing.